So this is crazy. Imagine you're the most dominant player in a game, but that game is one built off of alliances. And your dominance, it is directly a product of the alliances that you have. But one day you wake up and you decide, you know what? I'm so dominant, I can probably do this alone. Not realizing that everything is about to come crashing down. You've literally become so powerful that you've completely forgotten how you got there. But what you don't realize is that your allies, well, they hold more power than you think. And in this power-drunken state, you decide that you aren't just going to challenge your partners and your enemies. You're also going to bully them to get an even bigger piece of the pie for yourself. And at the same time that you're realizing that you aren't as dominant as you thought, you're starting to realize that the other players hold cards that you desperately need. And not only that, your most important partner in the entire game, well, they hold a secret card. And that card can be played at any time. And when they do play it, it's going to cause you more pain than you ever imagined. That is exactly the game that's playing out right now on the global stage. The US is, of course, the dominant player. The partner that is so vital to the US's success, that's Canada. But even though they seem smaller and they seem weaker, and they rely heavily on the US, there's one card that they hold that gives them a significant amount of power when it comes to the final outcome. So now the game's changed. And even though the US thinks that it gets to dictate the rules, it's about to find out that it cannot afford a trade war with Canada. But before we get into that, if you want the truth, the real truth about finance and economics, this is the place for you. So do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. And let me know what you think. Is the US starting a fight that it cannot win? Or do they really have the leverage that they think they do? Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss this whole situation. Because right now, the US is consistently threatening its allies. And in addition to that, it's threatening its most significant trading partner, Canada. Now, are there other countries that do more trade with the US? Well, if you take oil out of it, yeah, absolutely. But that isn't the most important piece of this puzzle. Because unlike China, who imports completed goods to the US, Canada isn't just a trading partner. They don't typically export finished products into the US. In other words, Canada is very much integrated into the US's supply chain. And that is just one of several significant issues that are going to come into play as the US attempts to bully its significantly smaller neighbor to the north. Now, there's a bunch of assumptions that can easily be made about Canada and the US's trade relationship. The first and the most significant is that Canada is in fact a smaller nation and relies heavily on the US. And while it's true that 75% of Canada's exports do in fact go to the US, that doesn't necessarily put them in a position of weakness. In fact, it may very well be the opposite. It may put them in a position of greater strength, especially relative to countries like China, when it comes to the trade relationship and the power that they wield. And even though the US economy is significantly bigger, the largest in the world, the impact of the US bullying Canada and threatening things like tariffs and taking over bridges doesn't just impact Canada. Every shot that America takes at Canada, at least right now, has a significant impact on the US. Well, the US may be able to take shots at China and put tariffs on finalized goods that are coming into the country. When the US takes shots at Canada and tariffs Canadian exports coming into the US, they aren't tariffing finalized goods. The US is actually tariffing the inputs to the goods that are made in America, which means the cost of the American goods goes up as well. And this is a significant difference. There's no other country in the world that is as integrated into US production as Canada, which is just one of the reasons why a trade war with Canada makes no sense. But there's more. But before we talk about the other issues with this, we need to talk about why tariffs seem like they're a clean lever and why they actually aren't. Because even though tariffs seem like a tool that is easily controlled and on paper seem like something that can have a significant effect on another country, quite often what happens on paper and what happens in reality are totally different. While applying pressure to a country like China has one effect, if you overlook the impact of a country like Canada and the impact on domestic supply chains, there's a high probability that you'll end up overestimating the impact on the local economy. So even though the reasoning seems clear and straightforward in theory, it's not. And it's complicated enough with a country like China, but it gets even more complicated with a country like Canada. And that's because there's a real world problem with the whole model and idea of tariffs. The logic, at least in theory, works well in simulations, but it doesn't work well in the real world. Because when you run a simulation, there's only so many variables you can account for. It's the unexpected variables that you don't think about that create the real world consequences. And furthermore, when you put tariffs on a country that is so integrated into the production of the goods that are made in America, you're not talking about a transactional issue. You're actually creating a whole set of structural issues that can disrupt trade really quickly. And I'd liken this to what happened with supply chains during COVID. All of a sudden, ships weren't able to get to port. Then there was that ship in the Suez Canal that basically halted trade almost completely worldwide for a few weeks. Now take an integrated supply chain between two countries and shut that down. And I'm telling you right now that if you thought the supply chain issues in 2020 and 2021 and 2022 were bad, this is going to get a whole lot worse. And that's because treating international trade, especially with an important trading partner, like it's transactional, creates an assumption that has a fundamental flaw. And the fundamental flaw is treating Canadian trade as if it is foreign trade, because it's not. Canada is fundamental to the infrastructure of the United States. We share a significant amount of production between the two countries. Think about automobiles. Think about housing. Think about things like oil, which is shipped to the US to gas plants that are built to deal with Canadian crude. So you have to think of Canadian imports not in the same way that you think of Chinese imports, but as inputs for US production. And even though Canada is listed as a foreign supplier on paper, the reality is they might as well be the 51st state, because the raw inputs that come from Canada, they're vital to the US economy. And to put this in perspective, let's just talk about cross-border production. Because quite often, components, they actually cross the US-Canada border repeatedly. A raw material, like steel, might go from Canada to the US and get made into a part for a vehicle. That part may then eventually find its way back across the border to Canada, where the vehicle is actually produced. And then the final version of that vehicle could once again be shipped back to the US. Now, keep in mind that the producers of these automobiles are American companies. But now you're taking something that is already historically expensive, and you're shipping it back and forth across the border multiple times, and each time it crosses the border, there are tariffs charged. And that is increasing the overall cost of the automobile significantly. And this is why the US can't treat Canada as if they're just a foreign nation importing things. They aren't China, who is shipping the whole automobile or shipping the whole finished product. They are literally part of the production process. But tariffing goods as they go back and forth across the border has a significant impact on the cost for Americans. And while on the surface it might seem like the solution to that is simple, just start producing everything in the US, well, it's not that simple. Because what works on paper, in reality, isn't that easy. In fact, it would probably take the US years, if not decades, to shift the entirety of the production from Canada to the US. But more importantly, it doesn't make sense for the US to do that, because they already have a system in place that works. And it works to the benefit of both Americans and Canadians. In fact, some might argue it's probably more beneficial to the US than it is to Canada. And to make it clear, this relationship, this manufacturing relationship between the US and Canada, it's one of the most efficient relationships between two countries in the world. Even the EU, which virtually has completely free trade, doesn't have the same sorts of relationships that exist between the US and Canada. And this efficiency, it creates both strength and fragility, because the optimization between the two countries, it reduces redundancy and costs. But at the same time, that efficiency, it raises vulnerabilities if the two countries ever get into a conflict. And here's the reality of the situation. These are two countries that should never be in a conflict. They rely so heavily on each other that they may as well be one. So the reality is that treating Canada as if it's a foreign supplier, not like it's a piece of domestic production, is what causes issues. And the most significant issue is that tariffs between the two countries, they act as multipliers. and they act as multipliers in the worst way, affecting the costs of goods for Americans, creating inflation, creating a higher cost of living, and effectively creating a situation that could hurt the US economy quite significantly. And the compounding mechanism here is simple. Tariffs stack repeatedly on the same goods. If it's being produced in both countries and the goods going back and forth, the inputs are taxed repeatedly, that increases the prices. These aren't one-time adjustments like the goods coming in from China that are fully produced. These are multiple adjustments that arguably increase the prices of American goods significantly more than any tariff on China ever would. And it all comes down to one thing, and that is the increase in the production cost that happens so freaking rapidly when you tariff the inputs that you're using to produce your own goods. And this is where efficiency becomes such a significant problem, because there is a concept known as just-in-time production, which means that effectively, the inputs for goods are produced and delivered exactly when needed. But just-in-time production turns into just-in-trouble production when you start taxing the goods and creating border inefficiencies. Because even a minor disruption in something like one single part for a car can disrupt the entire supply chain. And the more you increase border uncertainties, the more you increase the need for inventory, which means warehousing and even higher costs, on top of the already higher costs from tariffing the inputs. And these hidden costs, they don't show up as tariff rates. They show up as inflation. They show up as significantly higher costs for things like automobiles, things like food, and things like gasoline, which are the very goods that affect the American consumer the fastest and the most. So on paper, the idea of using tariffs as leverage, it looks good. But in real life, when used as leverage for negotiation, they can create a lot of pain really fast. And this is why in theory, they seem like they might be a good idea, but they turn into absolute chaos. And by the way, this has happened before. But before we talk about that, let's talk about where the pain shows up first. And that's in what we call the big four, the four biggest household expenses. That's energy, cars, food, and housing. This is where the costs of tariffs with a trading partner that is so vital to production really start to hurt. And this is what gives Canada an unfair advantage and makes the US so vulnerable when they start to throw their weight around. Because the dynamics of trade between Canada and the US means that Canada can influence transport, they can influence materials, and they can influence affordability very, very quickly. And as you'll see in a second, they can do it strategically without having to affect the entire country, but only a few key places that matter. But first, let's talk about where this shows up the quickest. Canada supplies most foreign crude oil in the US, and most US refineries are set up to process Canadian heavy crude. To retool these refineries would take a significant amount of time, meaning that even though this whole thing that happened with Venezuela might mean that there's more oil coming to the US, the ability to refine it is years, if not decades away. So when the US starts putting tariffs on Canada, it can raise fuel prices. But not only that, the US is so reliant on Canadian energy that Canada can actually do a reverse tariff and charge more for the oil that the US desperately needs, meaning that they have their own piece of leverage on that end. Then there's manufacturing. Whatever's left of US manufacturing, it relies heavily on uninterrupted border crossings. So tariffs on Canadian parts increase US vehicle costs. Vehicle prices are already at ridiculously high prices. And I can tell you this, the US market, the US consumer, they're not looking for new ways to pay more for automobiles, which are already insanely priced. But supply disruptions as a result of tariffs, not only can they potentially increase the price of the vehicles, but Canada could hold back just one or two key parts and essentially stop the production of vehicles completely, increasing the prices even more and costing the US thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of jobs. Then there's food and agriculture. This is kind of a quiet one, but it becomes a voter issue really quickly. And we'll talk about why that's so important in a second. The US does import a lot of food from Canada, but that's not the biggest risk. The biggest risk is the fact that they import a significant amount of the fertilizer that is used to grow US crops, which means disruptions in that fertilizer or higher prices in that fertilizer can increase US farm costs, can delay production, and can hurt farmers who, in the best of times, are typically already hurting. And not only that, Canada is a major importer of US food. So that can impact the US farmers even more, creating a catastrophic effect for the US farming industry if Canada decided to retaliate in that way. And by the way, food costs, this is one of the things that shows up fastest. And it doesn't just show up in costs, it shows up at the voting booth, which gives Canada another key piece of leverage when it comes to a trade war with the US. And then last but not least, there's housing and construction. US construction relies pretty heavily on Canadian lumber and metals. In fact, in 2018, there was a trade dispute between the two countries on Canadian steel, and Canada was able to affect US manufacturers so significantly and so quickly that the manufacturers stepped in and lobbied to have the tariffs removed. It wasn't Canada that forced the US government's hand, it was the companies and the organizations and the people affected by the trade war at home in the US that changed their own government's mind. And higher construction costs, they lead to increased home prices, which creates more and more affordability challenges, and that becomes yet another issue that shows up at the voting booth. So the question is, if the US is so reliant upon Canada, why is this happening now? Well, first and foremost, the world's changing. The US is becoming less and less reliable, at least in the eyes of foreign nations, every single day. And that's causing countries to look for other options. In this case, Canada had no choice but to diversify. And what's crazy about this is that typically Canada follows the US's lead when it comes to China. But in a scenario where Canada found itself less being able to rely on its biggest trading partner, it had to find other options. So in order to make sure that the exports of Canadian agriculture weren't disrupted, it turned to the US's biggest trading enemy, China. And in exchange for Canada opening up the market to approximately 49,000 Chinese-made electric vehicles per year, China opened up the door for Canada to send more of its agricultural exports to China. And this is a double-edged sword. It gives Canada an alternative of where it can sell its goods, meaning that there's potentially more demand, which increases costs. But it also means that there's less supply available for the US, which will increase the cost for the US as well. So in a scenario where the US said, we're the bigger player, we're going to use our leverage against you, little Canada, Canada went to the other big player and said, hey, can you maybe help us out? And ultimately those options actually make things more expensive for the US, even though they thought that Canada had no other options. And this becomes a flashpoint for the US because the US worries about China-linked influence in North America. They don't want Canada and Mexico trading more with China. They want Canada and Mexico to trade with the US, but they also seem to want to bully those two countries. So in theory, when they thought Canada had no other options, the US's own actions caused Canada to look elsewhere, which actually created less power for the US. On top of that, the timing of this is really bad for everybody. The US-Mexico-Canada agreement, it's coming up for review this year. And that's raising the stakes for everybody. And arguably, a closer relationship with China gives Canada a little bit more leverage when it comes time to negotiate. If you want us to not deal with your biggest opponent, what are you going to give us? But ultimately what this all comes down to is power. And when the US starts to abuse their power, the other countries, they're bound to find ways to create more power on their own. So at the end of the day, these policies, they've been studied. They've been tried in the past, and they never work. And not only that, these policies, they not only backfire from a consumer cost perspective, but also they backfire politically. Because Canada will not fight this battle by putting its own blanket tariffs on US goods. No, they've got way more leverage than that. They're going to rely on political influence instead. The way they'll do that is not by fighting economically. They're clearly at a disadvantage there, but by increasing the political risk if the US decides to escalate. And in this case, they don't actually need to outright win. They can use a strategic approach that is significantly more cost effective by making the pain where it really hurts even more painful and using that pain as a political tool in order to de-escalate. So what ends up happening here is not counter tariffs, it's countermeasures. And Canada will target the industries that can create the most pain and also have the strongest US government lobbying. This is targeted retaliation. that sparks quicker domestic opposition than it does broad economic issues. And while this might seem like it's limited in theory, it's actually not. It can create the most change the fastest by simply creating issues for the US economy that ultimately creates issues for the politicians in Congress and causes them to put a stop to whatever crazy thing is going on between the US and Canada. And this part isn't in theory. This isn't what's on paper. This part has literally happened before. There's been ongoing disputes over softwood lumber that go back decades. And these disputes, they are directly felt in US housing costs. And as we all know, higher housing prices leads to domestic pressure on the government to ease the tension and lower costs. And if the simplest way to lower housing costs, the new construction costs, is to back off on tariffs with Canada, you better believe that the government is going to lean towards that option. Then there's the 2008 template for strategic retaliation that I talked about before. This was in 2018 when steel and aluminum tariffs led to swift, focused Canadian retaliation. And it was US industry pressure that removed these tariffs. It was the industries that went to the government and said, what you're doing is hurting manufacturing, it's hurting costs. And this demonstrated the success of Canada's targeted response. And these examples show consistently over and over and over again Canada's willingness to face short-term pain in order to get what they want. They don't need to win, they just need to be strategic because they are part of the American supply chain and they do have a significant amount of leverage. And quite often that leverage is in the places that will hurt the US the most. So while bullying the 51st state, the smaller and significantly less economically significant country, seems like it might be a good idea, it's typically the beginning of the end. So yes, the US is without a doubt the most dominant player in the trade game. But that dominance, it relies heavily on their partners. And those partners have significantly more leverage than you might think because they can quickly impact the domestic market. So a policy that's designed to hurt Canadians can, in effect, hurt them temporarily, but ultimately hurt the Americans much more and much quicker. And when Canada acts strategically in this way, inflation comes quickly, and it comes before the negotiations have even started in some cases. But it's the political backlash that comes before the resolution that ultimately changes the game and reduces the amount of leverage that the US at least has on paper. But most importantly, it's the damage that can be caused to the supply chain very quickly that gives Canada the leverage it needs in order to force the US to act like a partner and not like a villain. And in theory, yeah, pressure will come before pain when it comes to tariffs. But in reality, the pain always comes first. And with a country like Canada, having alternatives that create even more pain like China, the US, even though it seems like they have more to gain than lose, actually has more to lose than gain by pressuring its most important trade partner. So while on the surface, a trade war with Canada seems like it would be manageable, massive economy, small economy, we can bully them all day, every day, they don't even have a military, it's the supply chain dynamics that reveal that the leverage that you think you have isn't actually there. Because the reliance on Canada with respect to the supply chain is real. And it's a trade-off. Canada relies on the US for a lot of things, but don't underestimate how much the US relies on Canada for a large portion of its manufacturing. And at the end of the day, the US could very likely face noticeable domestic consequences before ever reaching its strategic aims with respect to tariffs on Canada. Because Canada has the ability to implement countermeasures that will speed up the opposition to the tariffs within the US before they ever become damaging to Canada. But the lesson here is really simple. Who wins a trade war is not determined by who holds the most leverage. It isn't determined by who has the biggest economy. It's shaped by who experiences the impact the most and the quickest. And that doesn't necessarily mean costs. A lot of times it's political. And the consequences, they don't wait for the whole negotiation to play out. They happen almost immediately. And worst of all, they happen for consumers first, before manufacturing, before government ever feels the pain. Oh, and by the way, if you want to know why the US will never win a trade war with China, make sure you check out this video right here.